Welcome to Chautauqua People. My guest today is Ed Evans, a true Chautauqua native. He grew up on the grounds of Chautauqua Institution, attended local schools, and graduated from Chautauqua High School. At Fredonia State, he studied political science, media, and journalism. After college, he worked for 12 years as a news reporter and anchor, including 4 years in Detroit. Subsequently, he was a stay-at-home dad while his children were little, and has taught media subjects at SUNY Broome Community College in Binghamton for the past 11 years. Ed, how did your family make its way to Chautauqua?
Well, it's part of the story goes back a little over 200 years. My family's ancestors settled on Chautauqua Lake. Jeremiah Griffith Point, that's the ancestral lineage of my mother's side of the family. My father was from Massachusetts, outside of Boston. My mother and father developed a relationship during World War II, and my father, after the war, got a job with one of the furniture companies in Jamestown and was out in the Midwest as a sales rep. The economy went bad. Family moved back here because there was a support mechanism, and part of the family had a house on the grounds, and that's how we ended up living on the grounds, and that's how I ended up growing up on the grounds of Chautauqua and going to Chautauqua Central School. What was your childhood like on the grounds? It was, I guess the best way to describe it, it was a story of two worlds. The off-season, September to June, was pretty quiet. Beginning of June, and you know, basically had your school community and school friends, and then along about the middle of June, things would really kick up, and the 8 weeks of the season, there was just an introduction of people from all over. Met other kids from, you know, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, New Jersey, Florida, you know, different parts of the country, and in some instances, different countries would be here. So it was really, you know, two completely different worlds. And on top of that, the culture that was at Chautauqua, and my appreciation of some of the arts has its roots from growing up on the grounds.
Right. Now, did you walk to school then?
Every day.
Walked out the main gate?
Most every day. It was rare that, you know, we'd get a ride to school, but we were close enough that that was walking distance to the school.
And how big was your high school graduating class? Do you remember?
About 50.
About 50 in your graduating class.
And about 300 in the 7 through 12 grades. And as it turned out, all of my school years were in the building that was right across the highway from Chautauqua. The elementary school, it's the Turner School that now is part of Chautauqua Institution. That was built and that opened up as a K through 6 school, and the first year that was open was my 7th grade year.
Did you protest and say,
no.
Unfair?
Not really, because it had a pool,
yeah.
And as a result of that new project, we had access to a swimming pool. And it was not only part of our athletic regimen. They would have weekend swims. You know, there were Saturday swims. So it opened up a new opportunity having that.
Right, that's nifty. And then, have you kept in touch with many of your fellow graduates from that high school?
I see them. There's some I see on a regular basis. One of my friends who was in a grade ahead of me, Rick DeKay, he and his wife, we have breakfast, he and his wife, and my wife Robin and I have breakfast, you know, when we're together out here weekends, we'll get together.
That's nifty.
And some of our neighbors here are neighbors, or some of my high school friends. Paul Spaz, who raises cows and worked at one of the automotive factories here. just retired from that. He was one of my high school classmates.
That's nifty. That's nifty. And when we look at your background here, there's this marvelous book and Hidden Treasure. And I wonder if you could tell me how that came along.
Basically, I worked as a journalist for 12 years. When you do that kind of work, you never quite leave it behind. In the course of being at home with the kids, I didn't lose interest in stories that would come along. And in 2000, my brother called me and said, hey, the Chautauqua Post Office is being nominated for the Great American Post Office Award. And so I started looking into it, and one of the criteria for nomination was the significance of the architect. And the architect of the Chautauqua Post Office building was an architect named Edward B. Green, who the majority of his work was in and around Buffalo, New York. And it turns out he was a very significant but locally known architect of the late 1800s and early 1900s. And the fact that this post office was one of his buildings, that was key in guiding the Chautauqua Post Office to being recognized in the year 2000 as the Great American Post Office by the Smithsonian National Postal Museum.
Got it.
In some of the research, there were references to E.B. Green as being Chautauqua Institution's architect. And when I saw that notation, I knew there had to have been more than just the post office building. And in doing research, I realized there was a whole category of some of Chautauqua's most significant buildings that were attributed to E.B. Green and the firm of Green and Wicks. And it included the Hall of Philosophy, the post office, the Colonnade building that was built in 1909, the Bell Tower building, which is the icon of Chautauqua and internationally recognized. And it was basically a decade. And I knew that that was an untold story of Chautauqua's history. And I realized that it raised the significance of some of Chautauqua's architecture, not only because E.B. Green did it, but because of some of the other largely significant cultural projects that he worked on, including the Albright Knox Art Gallery in Buffalo, the Toledo Museum of Art, the Dayton Institute of Art in Dayton, Ohio, the Albright Library in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and the New York State Fairgrounds in Syracuse, New York.
Goodness, goodness. And I've been in the Toledo Museum, not the others. That's a fine building. Absolutely a wonderful building.
And it was a project that was driven by Edward Libby, Libby Glass. And Green and Wicks, E.B. Green was not just involved in the initial project. He was involved in the Toledo Museum of Art through several phases of it across 20 years. It was a remarkable project in the list of his works.
And we're blessed to have these buildings. I'm just curious, is that firm still around in any form?
No, it really, it went through several different partnerships. And I think his work, he continued working as an architect into the 1940s in a remarkable career. And kind of the last generation of his work was during the Second World War that he felt as his contribution to the war effort. He designed houses for some of the factory workers up in the Buffalo area. He felt that could be his contribution to the war effort.
Right. Now, many know you for your work on the documentary about the presidential visit of Mr. Clinton in preparation for the presidential debate. Can you tell me about that?
It really, I was fascinated when I heard that happen in 1996, that they had chosen Chautauqua as kind of a preparation site. In my journalism background, I knew that those kinds of things don't just happenstance. And I also knew that if the president was here for 3 days, presidential photographers were here as well. In 2006, the Presidential Library in Little Rock, Arkansas, the Clinton Presidential Library, opened and began accepting requests for documents and photographs. And I thought it was well worth the time to put in a request for the photographs that were taken by the photographers at Chautauqua. Mm-hmm. And it turned out there was not just one photographer here for the 3-day visit. There were 3 White House photographers on site at Chautauqua. Mm-hmm. Dozens and dozens of rolls of film were shot of the activities of the president on the grounds at Chautauqua, including the rounds of golf that he played, including the walks that he and Mrs. Clinton took around the grounds, and the different encounters with the media that they had, and some of the activities that occurred with the staff at the Athenaeum Hotel. And I just kept delving into it and retrieving documents and doing interviews with people from Chautauqua who were part of that visit. But also, I did an interview with Senator George Mitchell, traveled to New York City and interviewed him at his law office there. And he sat for an interview and talked about the significance of his role playing the part of Senator Bob Dole, who was the Republican opponent in the 1996 presidential race. And I also interviewed Kirk Hanlon, who was the lead advance staffer for the White House, who came to Chautauqua and evaluated whether Chautauqua would work for the kind of activities that they wanted to do, not only in preparation for the debate, but the fact that they were going to run the White House out of the grounds of Chautauqua for the days that the president was here in October of 1996. And as I did more of those interviews, I knew there was just a great story to tell about a presidential visit at Chautauqua. And I put together what they call a mini documentary that we showed in 2012 for John Schmitz at one of the heritage lectures put on by the Chautauqua Archives.
Now, those interviews were done on camera.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
If somebody wished to see your mini doc on that presidential visit, is it available in some form?
It is available at the Chautauqua Archives, and I will be posting it to a YouTube site in the near future. Wonderful. I've been encouraged by some of my colleagues that I should put together a YouTube site and post some of the documentary work that I've done. Wonderful. I've done these projects pretty much on my own with assistance from some of the students in the media program at SUNY Broome, but also I have a couple of other projects that we have done at school with students that we need a site where they need to be, it needs to be a home site where they can be accessed and watched. Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me a little more about your work at SUNY Broome?
As my youngest child was getting into high school, my wife and I made a move up to Binghamton, New York. Wanted to get away from the high cost of suburban New York City. We also wanted to be closer to family, and the opportunity, my wife had a job opportunity in Binghamton, and we realized that that location would work because it also put us closer in proximity to Chautauqua, where we have a seasonal residence. And in the course of getting up to Binghamton, I started applying for jobs, and there was an opportunity to do part-time teaching at SUNY Broome, and my media background fit with the course opportunity that was there. And that worked. That's worked for 11 years. And I've taught a number of different classes, a basic mass media course. I've taught broadcast journalism, field video production, public relations, mass media research, radio production. So I've been able to apply a lot of my skill set as a journalist and a media person bring it into the classroom and work with students in that regard.
We were involved in a project several years ago, which sounds absurd. I did an interview in North Carolina. You did one in Binghamton, and they were linked on Skype, and the people had never used Skype before. Tell us about that.
There was a photographer in Binghamton, Ed Aswad, and he had retired from photography after, I think, parts of 5 decades. He began his photography work in the 1950s and retired just a few years back. And he had retired to North Carolina, not too far from you. In the course of his retirement, he donated the body of his work to our college. And the vice president who facilitated that donation was a good friend of Ed Aswad's. And I thought it was really fitting if we could get an interview with Ed Aswad. And really the only way to do it, because he was not coming back to Binghamton, was if we could work something out. And it was happenstance that you and I met at Chautauqua, and realized that you were not too far away from where Ed Aswad lived. And we put the project together. And you took your camera gear to his location, and one of my students worked with me to set up our vice president, Dr. Francis Battisti, on location at our campus. And they were able to talk to each other through Skype, which they had never done before. And you captured the real-time interview on your site, and we captured our end. And then one of our students sat down and put the whole project together, and we had a nice 10-minute interview with Ed Aswad recounting his early interest in photography and the early cameras that he worked with, film cameras, and then subsequently moving into the digital age. And he spoke about the different work that he'd done as a commercial photographer, and the fact that over the course of his years he had photographed, I believe it was 4 different presidents during their visits to Binghamton for one reason or another.
And I thought that student did a terrific job editing and fitting things together. And I thought you probably worked with him in some detail, and that was just magnificent.
Well, we had approximately a 45-minute interview, and we knew that we wanted to take the best of the answers and to have something that was right around 10 minutes. And the original purpose of doing that was to show that interview. We held special screenings the night that the Ed Aswad collection debuted at the library on the campus of SUNY Broome. And we were able to show this interview, and that people who visited and looked at the exhibit were able to come in and really get a first-hand look and hear Ed Aswad talk about his work and his life's work as a photographer in and around Binghamton.
And I thought it was a fine job at the end. I hope you'll put it on the YouTube site.
Yeah.
When,
that's one that needs to be up there as well.
You bet, you bet. Now, let's talk a little more about many documentaries and what you see the purpose of them.
I think you can tell, at least for me, doing a short documentary, whether it's a half hour or whether it's just 10 minutes, or 15 minutes. You don't have as much complexity. And in my world, if I want to work with a student on a project like that, to be able to take something contained, you can fit the project in the course of a semester or in the course of a school year and get it done. You have so many pieces to any documentary, whether a full-length or a shorter documentary, that you have to identify the story you want to tell. You have to do the interviews. You have to plan out what you're going to tell in the interview. You have a certain amount of research that needs to be done. And then you have your editing and your post-production. All of that it's pretty intense to have that, all of those skill sets to be able to put them together. A mini documentary is really doable in terms of touching all the pieces of that and trying to get it all together. And I find a shorter project, if I'm doing it, like for example, the projects working on for a Chautauqua type project, the story is a smaller story. It's suitable to a shorter format documentary. And it really lends itself better to bringing students in and working with them in that. And also, if I'm working on a project, it's not going to be a perfect project. And it doesn't have to be a perfect project. And there's a little more room for error. And when you have error, that's where a lot of the learning comes in, when you're doing the kind of work that I do in trying to bring students into a project and helping them understand how a project like that comes together.
Right. Can you tell us a little bit about the project we sent students to Florida a couple of years ago? And I thought they did some nature studies there, went down with cameras and the like.
The end project is called Experiencing the Everglades. The genesis of the project is that in our biology department, for the past 40 years, every year they have a class. It's called Ecology of the Everglades. And it's a 200-level class. And they have a class of about 24 students. And they take them down for 2 weeks on location in the Florida Everglades. They camp, they study the foliage, they study the wildlife. The students pick different aspects that they will research and then present to the larger group. And they have adventures out in the Everglades. The project was suggested to us, did we have students who would be interested in going on the trip, but not as biology students, but as communication students. And I put the project together and identified students who had the capability to do the equipment, but also could take direction and work on their own in, a remote location like that, and be able to shoot documentary footage. And it worked. I mean, we were in communication with them every day. Mm-hmm. But the whole process of planning it and planning the gear pack that they would take with them and the different elements of the study that they would videotape and the different questions that they should ask the students. All of that we put in motion in pre-planning. And then when they came back, we reviewed it all and identified how the project would go together. We actually, at this point, it's still the longer version needs some final editing work, but we have a 28-minute documentary that we are discussing with our local PBS station of whether they would like to use it as a student documentary as part of their local programming. And we have edited shorter versions too. I think we have a 15-minute version and a 10-minute version mm-hmm. that we're using for different applications. Mm-hmm. The learning in that was tremendous because there were students who didn't go on the trip that were involved in some of the pre-production work. And then some of the faculty were involved in terms of putting the professional gear pack together. And then at the end of it, we debriefed the students. When the two of them who went on the trip came back, we sat down and we talked about the equipment that they used, the equipment that they had, what they took that they didn't use, that they ultimately didn't feel they should have taken at all, and then also what they didn't have with them that they really wished they would have had. Because a lot of our pre-planning was guesswork. We were guessing at not just what they would need, but what we thought might be useful to them. Because the location where they were going in the Everglades, they were going to be 50 miles away from anything. If you needed batteries, you were 50 miles away.
Right.
So we not only planned for what they needed, we planned for some redundancy. We sent them down there with Canon XA10 cameras, which are good field cameras. They also had a pair of GoPros, one of them equipped with an underwater box so they could shoot underwater footage. I think in all they had 7 or 8 cameras with them. You know, we had redundancy, so if a camera, you know, got wet or was lost for some reason, they had backup cameras to work with. We sent them with a Canon camera to take production photos. You know, it was a pretty complicated project, and they did. For them, it was independent study, 4 credits in documentary filmmaking.
That's great. I think it's marvelous that students can do that at the community college level, well led by faculty, and then have something that's actually in play for production and distribution by the local PBS station.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely speaks well about the community college experience.
It was not a perfect experience, but it was, there were a lot of moving parts to it.
Mm-hmm.
And all of us who were involved in that learned something
Indeed.
from the project.
Indeed. Ed, we're almost out of time. What's next for you?
Just continuing to work on some of the documentary work. I want to do short documentaries on each of the presidential visits to Chautauqua. The other documentary I did for an Archives Heritage Lecture was about Al Engel, the pioneer aviator. He was from Cleveland, Ohio. He was a colleague of Glenn Curtis, and Al Engel flew pioneer airmail routes on Chautauqua Lake.
Wow.
And I have a 20-minute documentary. I have some additional interviews and want to do a re-edit of that because I think there's a lot of general interest in aviation. There's a lot of interest in the Postal Service, and part of what Al Engel did was he was part of the pioneer airmail service, which was basically the public relations forerunner to show that airmail could be the next big thing in mail delivery service for the U.S. And that was in the pre-World War I era.
Wow, wow, that's terrific. This has been terrific. I can't believe we're out of time.
I can't either.
And I hope you'll come back, and we've got some more stories and maybe some more docs to share.
Thank you very much.